Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 54. My guest in this episode is Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. Dr. Hughes is a philosopher of mind and metaphysics who specializes in the thought of Whitehead, Nietzsche, and Spinoza. He works in the fields pertaining to panpsychism and altered states of consciousness. He's a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Exeter. He's also a published author, having published a book called Pneumatics in 2015, Modes of Sentience in 2021, and most recently Philosophy and Psychedelics in 2022, in which he was co-author and contributor, or co-editor rather, and contributor. So in the book Modes of Sentience, which we will be covering in this conversation, we talk about panpsychism, Whitehead, and psychedelics, and among many other things. And Dr. Hughes goes into detail about those three matters and again more. And so I would attach a small caveat to this, that we are not endorsing the use of psychedelics or psychoactive substances. We're talking rather objectively and matter-of-factly about them, and I know I can respect your maturity in that sense, that we are here to just discuss them as they are a phenomena in the human experience. So thank you very much for joining Dr. Hughes and myself as an observer of this conversation. I hope there's good takeaway for you. I thank you as always for coming to the IdeaCast interview series, especially if you're a subscriber. I very much appreciate that. I do this as a hobby. I draw no income from it, so it's a labor of love. And having Dr. Hughes on, it was a great experience. I'm very grateful to him for his company. So thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes to the IdeaCast interview series. I've been waiting for this one, been anticipating it, and looking forward to it. And in this conversation, we're going to be talking about Dr. Hughes' work and his most recent publication that I have access to. I haven't picked up, I don't have all three copies of the books that Dr. Hughes has worked with, but I have Modes of Sentience here, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. And Peter, welcome. I'm so glad to have you on the IdeaCast interview series.
Pleasure to be here, Justin. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, I'm honored to have you here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, as I mentioned, and to the YouTube audience, I welcome you all as well. I hope this is a fruitful conversation. Thank you for being a passive attendee, and I hope you come away with some good insights with Dr. Hughes's books and his ideas. So, I want to start, I guess, laying out some history with you and your coming to where you are now, and where you found the space and the ideas to write the book. Now, as I understand it, you have you got your PhD in panpsychism, and you had an advisor. Who was your advisor for that?
Well, I started off with my in Britain we call it PhD supervisor. So that was Michael Housekeller to start with, who's now moved to Liverpool University. He was at Exeter at first. He was the first person to write an introduction to Whitehead in German, apparently. And I also had Tom Roberts and John Dupre, who's quite known in sort of process biology. And then for PhD examination was with in-house, it was Joel Kruger as a phenomenologist, and external examiner was Galen Strawson, who's the leading panpsychist of the day, I'd say. Yeah.
And so what was the thumbnails, like if you could give a brief summary of what your thesis was and what you were bringing?
Well, it was called, it's entitled Pansentient Monism.
Okay.
And it was really, it was an argument for an identity theory of panpsychism, which is a common theory, I suppose. But it was, I related it to psychoneural identity theory, which is, for those who don't know, it's the theory that the mind is the brain. It was very common in the mid 20th century, but then went out of fashion almost overnight because of this multiple realization argument, which sort of ushered in functionalism. But but the thing is, if you believe in identity panpsychism, so mind and matter are essentially the same thing, numerically identical, then how do you face the problems that psychoneural identity theory faced? So the sort of that was the general gist of the PhD, really.
Okay.
So overcoming that.
Okay. All right. And is that available online if anybody is curious into a deep dive that might have access to academic papers, or is it behind a paywall or a?
It's not behind a paywall, but it's not accessible either. It's just not out there yet. And the reason is I've been thinking about publishing it, but just I haven't had time to get around to editing it, because normally you have to adjust PhD to make it publishable, make it a little bit more accessible and so on. So I just haven't had time. But I might just there's an idea that I'll publish it with the Psychedelic Press, an independent publisher I work with. But that's in the pipeline.
Yeah, and you're a busy man, so I understand. So I'm just throwing that out there in case people are really want to go beyond this conversation and discover more about what you've done and where you're coming. But your 3 books should be sufficient for now. And if you be able to arrive at that space to be able to do that, that would be great. But
I know it will definitely come out at some point. The question is when.
When exactly. So and as we were saying before we hit record, patience is a wonderful practice. So those of you chomping at the bit out there, if you're out there, you're good. So.
But the PhD is quite dry compared to the other books I published. It's quite a lot of dry logic and so on. But the introduction I sort of abridged a bit, and then that became the first chapter in Modes of Sentience, the chapter on panpsychism. So there's an element of the PhD there. Also, I modified a chapter on n-dimensional space, and that's also the last chapter in Modes of Sentience. And there's also an appendix in my PhD about perception, the 5 aspects of perception, which is also a chapter, pentalogy of perception in the modes. So I have in one way I have published the PhD, but modified it as parts of Modes of Sentience.
Okay. So again, that should be more than sufficient for someone whose curiosity is picked. So, and to the audience, I will say that Modes of Sentience is it is palatable and accessible to a general audience. You mentioned that in sort of bringing your PhD down to an apprehendable level, and so I will vouch for that. I'm probably the poster child for general audience, layperson. I have no formal education, but it was accessible to me. The n-dimensional space was a little something I'd probably have to read again and really sit with, and maybe go to Wikipedia a couple times. But other than that, I mean, it's very accessible, especially, and most of my subscribers are people who like philosophy of mind, they like metaphysics and ontology. So I don't see this book being any kind of a challenge for anyone who's already had some background with that. So as you pointed out in your first chapter and your PhD thesis, you mentioned panpsychism. And so again, as a sort of street level person, I would, and I love botany and horticulture, so I'll use my metaphors, that I see panpsychism as being a genus. Within it, there are maybe a couple of species of panpsychism that people bat about in discussion. Could you sort out panpsychism for us, for, again, maybe if someone's coming on board and listening to this conversation, to give us some clarity as to the vein of, and you alluded to it in what you said a moment ago, but as I understand it, there's sort of constitutive panpsychism, there's pan-experientialism, which I think is more closer to what you're doing. Could we unpack some of that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I suppose first thing is pan means all, psychism, psyche, all is soul, mind, all is mind, better. But that you could define idealism in that way as well, right? So here, I noticed that actually in some questionnaires regarding psychedelic experience, often those two definitions are conflated. So panpsychism, I think the difference between panpsychism and idealism, very generally speaking, is that panpsychism, for the most, and there are multiple varieties, as you say, for the most accepts the reality of space and time as something that's not completely mind-dependent. But it differs according to whom you say. So panpsychism view that all things, all self-sufficient units have an element of mind. So that doesn't need to be necessarily consciousness. It could be subconscious drives or so on, pleasure, pains, valence, value, basic value. So that would be, from a human to a mammal, fish, plant, even molecule, and so on and so forth, all the way down. But it's very important to distinguish units of subjectivity from aggregates, something Giordano Bruno did already in the 1500s. So a panpsychist wouldn't say, for example, my shirt as such is one single one single perspective or one single sentience. It's an aggregate of many. Whereas perhaps, you know, my own organism, that has at least one dominant monad, as Leibniz might say, so one dominant sentience. So obviously, but the one problem for panpsychism is actually how you distinguish monads or holons or units of subjectivity or actual entities, whatever, from aggregates. That's not always black and white. But anyway, so all these units, so the whole of nature ultimately is alive. Going down in complexity, if you want to go up, you get into more cosmic modes of panpsychism, like cosmopsychism, which is that, you know, even stars have sentience, perhaps planets, akin to the Gaia theory, all the way up to the universe, which is then cosmic consciousness or the absolute, or Spinoza's infinite intellect, perhaps. And then, of course, at that highest level, panpsychism turns into pantheism, that nature is God, or at least some form of consciousness or sentience. There are many varieties of panpsychism, as you say. I mean, Scribner, who's written a history of panpsychism, he argues that panpsychism is like a meta-ontology, in that you can get panpsychism, you can get dualist panpsychism, idealist panpsychism, neutral monist panpsychism, and so on. Galen Strawson, Karl Popper defined panpsychism as physicalism, as materialism. I think it's a little bit odd, but Galen Strawson's pretty adamant about it. Depends how you define physicalism, you see. So,
yeah, this is true.
I mean, one way that one proposed essential condition or attribute of physicalism is this thing called the no mentality principle, right? So if you include that as the core definition of physicalism, then panpsychism cannot be physicalism. But you don't. The argument is that you don't need to include that condition. So yeah, it's as with most of philosophy, often definitions become extremely important.
Yeah, you could get mired in semantics and definitions.
And then in the 20th century, philosophy of language was the sort of, at least in the English-speaking world, sort of dominant form of philosophy. But luckily, we've moved past that. There's more to it than language, I believe.
Yeah.
But anyway, so there's an overview of panpsychism. As you mentioned, I'm sort of more in line with pan-experientialism, which is the sort of process, or the Whiteheadian version of panpsychism. That was coined by a guy who just died, David Ray Griffin, just died last week. He was a great process philosopher. And the reason he coined it was because psyche can mean the soul, and it can mean sort of connote a self or a subject, whereas Whitehead believed that you could have experiences without, the experience belonging, as it were, to a self or a subject. So the experience alone is fundamental. So that therefore, one speaks about pan-experientialism. I don't think it's either here nor there, really. I mean, it's just a variety of panpsychism, because you can define psyche in an experiential manner anyway.
Okay. And your second chapter of your book, you give us an overview of Whitehead's process metaphysics. And so we could perhaps open that up a little bit to tie that into what you've just said. And so he tried to do some solution-oriented thinking here. And so what you were saying was a prehension, I think, where you don't necessarily have the it's cognition prior to metacognition, if that's a good way to say it again as a street person, or if you could do it better justice, the prehension versus, say, normal access consciousness and ego and things like that.
Okay, well, prehension is very, I think actually the most important concept in Whitehead's whole his whole system, I think, really. So the reason, it's an unusual word, prehension. Of course, it relates to apprehension, but it really, you couldn't use the word perception because of all the baggage it has, right? So what he was fighting against was this representationalist view, which is the belief that everything we perceive is a representation of reality. So when we perceive something, we have no real contact with it. We're sort of representing it in our minds. This is, in a Kantian view, an idealist view to a certain extent. So from that idealism, Whitehead moved into realism, organic realism, as he calls it, which means that you do actually see the world partially directly. So as opposed to a representation which is indirect. And prehension is the means by which that occurs. So prehension is the idea, I mean, it's multifaceted really, but essentially it's the idea that what one perceives, and that includes the immediate past, becomes part of one's oneself or one's current experience. So, for example, when I look at the sun, for that the sun, the light from the sun sort of enters my eye, becomes a part of the process that is my brain and body, and that is one continual process. And it's not like you know, first of all, there's just sort of pure electromagnetism from the sun, and then it goes into my brain, and then suddenly you've got this magical emergence or representation of the sun. Rather, the sun and the sunlight already has an element of experience within it. That's the experientialism. And when it hits us, that aspect becomes part of us. So that's an immediate sort of fusion of subject and object. And that's borrowed a little bit from Bergson, you could argue. Okay. And perhaps a little bit from F.H. Bradley. But that's essentially what prehension is. Also, one's immediate past flows into the present, which means that perception as prehension is both, well, prehension rather is both perception and causation. Okay. So this also is a sort of solution to Hume's problem of causation. You know, Hume famously said that we never see causation, we just see constant conjunction between two events in a regular manner. But he says, no, we do actually. In fact, all of perception is the direct prehension of causation. That's what perception is. So he overcomes that problem there in this manner. There are many more elements to it, though, because there's physical prehension, which is the prehension of the actualities around you and your past. There's also conceptual prehension, which is his take on Platonism, which is the ingression of what he calls eternal objects, akin to, but not exactly the same as Plato's forms. And then there are hybrid versions of that and so on. And you could, you know, it gets
once again,
yeah. You lose people, yeah. But that's the but the interesting thing is, like, so I think the great thing about prehension is that it's a realist doctrine that connects one to nature, and it at the same time is parsimonious because it brings together perception and causation and memory, for that matter, or immediate memory at least. It overcomes certain problems in philosophy, and it makes sense of certain intuitions that people have. So it's a very useful theory. It's quite unusual, and I don't think it's properly been elaborated on in the public eye, public intellectual sphere at least. So there's work to be done there. It's related to what Bergson calls sympathy as well. Okay. Very much related to that. Okay.
And just in the very short time that I've been interested in these kind of matters and non-matters, I've noticed that Whitehead is gaining traction. You know, I know Ian McGilchrist speaks of him and the work that he does, and I think Sheldrake is at least sympathetic to some of the ideas there. I don't know. I haven't heard him say anything. In fact, I've heard him in conversation with you, and you talked about that. And I like Sheldrake's morphic resonance because that's sort of on the back end. It's like not necessarily the parish objects of Whitehead's scheme, but it is nonetheless sort of on the other end of the eternal objects or the forms that you alluded to. And there's others that bring in that kind of idea where there is this sort of primordial or whatever you want to say, potential out there, templates of ideas or templates of possibility that can come into realization through relationality, through interaction. But yeah,
Rupert's son Merlin Sheldrake, I was on a panel with him a few months ago, and he's very much into Whitehead's philosophy as well, and he's getting into it, learning it more and more so. So yeah, no, it's becoming more dominant. It's strange it's not dominant really, and I think the reason is historical reason that, you know, like Whitehead was Bertrand Russell's teacher at Cambridge, and then became co-writers and friends, and then Whitehead went to London, and then he went to Harvard, and and taught in metaphysics later in life in Harvard. But he was very, in his lifetime, he was very influential, well-known philosopher. And then it seems that, and he complained about it himself at the end of life. He said, philosophy in Europe was becoming stale. And he was alluding to Wittgenstein and Ryle, Gilbert Ryle, so that's Cambridge and Oxford. And he said the future of philosophy lay in America. And he was referring to William James and Peirce and people like that, so, the sort of pragmatists. But unfortunately, what happened in Anglo-American philosophy is that kind of American strand somehow lost appeal. And like I was saying, the philosophy of language, initiated especially by Wittgenstein, became dominant. And as a result, the metaphysics of Whitehead was just completely seen as unimportant. And it was just sort of overshadowed by this philosophy of language. But now we're moving back really into, generally metaphysics, the study of ontology and causation and so on. That was seen as a sort of full science for much of the 20th century, or the latest, middle and later 20th century, because of other fashions in philosophy that came and passed. But now, metaphysics is again seen as very important in philosophy. In analytic philosophy as well. So, and as a result of that, people are looking back at Whitehead. There's another reason as well, I should say, which is that another reason as to why Whitehead's not that well known, and that's because. And I don't blame them, but this is what historically happened. There was a very strong sort of Methodist or Christian contingent in America, which promoted his work after his death. And I think a lot of people in Europe who are sort of, more secular and more secular than the American, to generalize, than the Americans, sort of started associating Whitehead with theology. Yeah. And this is, there are theological aspects of Whitehead's work, but this is not his main, not the core of his thought, at least not in my eyes. So that also put a lot of people off, I guess. But having said that, what they have achieved in America, like David Ray Griffin, whom I mentioned, John Cobb, and others, was pretty great. And the Center for Process Studies there in California, in Claremont, California, it's an excellent institution. So then they're doing excellent work. They've got a focus now on ecology, especially. So I'm not blaming them, but I'm just saying historically that's what happened. There were just fashions and biases in philosophy, as in everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. Historically, probably wasn't the right time for Whitehead's. Just a nod. I think it was a very casual nod to a god, if you will, because the god within, and again, very naive, but the god within his process scheme is participatory and it's adjunct. It is not necessarily, maybe the pars pro toto of the whole system. It may be, but in my interpretation is that it's along for the process. It is there. It may be the lure on the front end. It may be there for satisfaction on the back end. But the God term, and as you said, has been co-opted into process theology. But for me, when I work with it, and I'm very careful about the God word when I look at things, because it has so much baggage attached to it, but that it seems like it could be necessary, but not necessarily necessary aspect of what's going on in the metaphysics. But it nonetheless helps, I think, as a heuristic for us to understand maybe meaning or telos or what's going on with drive and all those things. So that's my way of gingerly kind of working with, but I could see where that's very off-putting in an empiricist world where we're all about rationality. And as you said, metaphysics is even far too woo-woo for some people, which I think is hilarious because again, I'm just an average person, but when I think of science, and spokespeople of science are always very much like, we need science. And it's like, yes, we do, but you need to bookend that with metaphysics, I think, because how are you going to postulate? How are you going to, look at your research and understand? You have to do philosophy on either end of this. So anyway,
funny you say bookend, yeah. Funny you say bookend because the word metaphysics comes from the book that came after the physics for Aristotle. So okay. In a way, a book that was a bookend. So, yeah, no, absolutely. Whitehead himself said that if you don't engage with metaphysics, you assume an uncritical metaphysics. In other words, you can't avoid metaphysics. It's like the basis not only of science, but also the basis of ethics and so on. And if there's just no escape from it. There's no default neutral view at all. You just assume one, and that informs your methodology. Yeah. So, and Whitehead was very explicit about that. But of course, there was a certain metaphysics that became prevalent in the West since Descartes' time, really, with a shift away from Aristotelian metaphysics, which was then dominant, to mechanism. Thanks to Descartes, Galileo, Bacon, people like that. And that is a metaphysics. That's an ontology. It's funny, as a kind of physicalism that stems from dualism, because in the Cartesian dualism that was so common, nature itself, or extension to space, was completely without mind. And so the work on physics, the work on matter, takes as default the metaphysics that there is no mind in matter. Yeah. And this is why panpsychism sounds kind of crazy to them, because it sort of goes against their working ideology. Of course, this is subconscious. They're not consciously aware of this, but this is the legacy of metaphysics in the past. But I think that's changing. I mean, I notice a lot of people are very interested in metaphysics now, especially like Spinoza, because it's kind of easy to explain the basics of Spinozism rather than Whiteheadianism. Yeah. And I think scientists also, I mean, when you actually speak to scientists, and I work with a number of them at Exeter, they really, they're open-minded to this. They just don't, it's just not their remit, they just don't think about it much. But they're interested in it. And it has got serious repercussions. For example, I'm working now on a paper to argue that you should use metaphysics in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because if you have a metaphysical experience, as it were, it would by means of psychedelics, then of course a recourse to metaphysics should be helpful in the integration of that experience. But of course, it's just not done, because in psychology, psychiatry, metaphysics is not an explicit discipline. Yeah. So there's it's not just a theoretical practice, it's also it can be even practical or therapeutic.
Yeah, a good example of how Whitehead, I'm sorry, were you going to continue with the thought? I was just going to segue a good example of how Whitehead's creeping into physics or theoretical physics is there's quantum Bayesianism or cubism, and Christopher Fuchs, I think, I don't know if you've seen any of his talks, but he had a talk that I was watching recently, and he brought Whitehead into and I don't know the Born rule, and I have a very coarse-grained grasp of what quantum Bayesianism is, but he was referencing the throbs of existence when it comes to an observer-dependent measurement, and so cubism is essentially a kind of statistical quantum physics. And again, you have to take the Born rule as a normative, and yada yada yada. You can look it up on your own, general audience out there. But I thought it was really interesting that he brought Whiteheadian perspectives into this, and there was another Whiteheadian term, but I remember the throb of existence, and that is the relationality between the observer and the probability wave and all the other squiggly math equations that go along with that. So
yeah, right.
That's a good example.
The living fire into the equations, as well. Yeah. I mean, Whitehead does talk about throbs of experience, and he got that partly from James, drops of experience. But that's part of the panpsychism, that you see the structural element of energy, and you can quantify it in various ways. But when you actually ask the question, what is energy itself, in whatever form it takes, this is sort of, one is blind to it if one only looks at the measurements of it. This is like Eddington's pointer readings argument for panpsychism, that you shouldn't think that matter is just its pointer readings. It's mass, it's charge, it's spin, it's quantum state, whatever it may be now. But I mean, Whitehead was in many ways a physicist as well. He was a mathematician first and foremost, chronologically, but he was very interested in physics, and he reformulated Einstein's relativity, and he was very much respected by physicists and mathematicians of his time. With Russell, he tried to prove the logical foundations of mathematics. That project was given up, but nonetheless it had a lot of influence. So I'm not surprised physicists take up his work now. I mean, like I say, there's been been a gap.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's informing biology, if I'm not mistaken. I know Matt Segal, whom I've interviewed on this channel, has been delving into that in the last, I guess, year or so. And so it's maybe not so much this linear adaptation process, and you know, there's ideas being batted about, and I couldn't do much justice to it, but that's another branch of science that maybe we could run things through the lens of this relationality and all the things that we've just been talking about, to understand our biology a little better too.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot to say there. I'd say one thing, there's something called like process biology. John Dupre at Exeter is actually a part of that.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that likes to take a lot of Whitehead system, but exclude pan-experientialism. But a direct way in which Whitehead had an influence on current biology is the new science of epigenetics, which is the science of how genes are expressed, conditioned by the environment of those genes, so the cell, the body, but also, you know, the environment, the external environment of the organism. So that was like heresy, biological heresy for 100 years or so. It's known, I mean, it's kind of Lamarckism as opposed to Darwinism. Okay. But in Modes of Thought, one of Whitehead's later books, he wrote about how a gene, we shouldn't understand things. There's what he calls the fallacy of simple location. We shouldn't take our perceptual view of things like a gene or an atom to represent the totality, the concrete totality of such a thing. Rather, such a thing, I say that in inverted commas, it's essentially, in essence, its relations. So a gene doesn't exist as such. It must be related to its external environment. Same with an atom. So you're right, it's like a gene or an atom in one location will be different from an atom that same, words don't do it justice, that same atom in a different location. So the environment is everything. So with genes, he said the same, this idea of the gene here, this was 1930s. And then Charles Waddington, who was the founder of epigenetics, he took up this hypothesis and tested it. And eventually this led, with the help of others, to the theory of epigenetics, which is now a thriving scientific discipline. So there's that's just one of many ways in which Whitehead has had an effect. I mean, his whole philosophy, he didn't call his philosophy process philosophy, he called it the philosophy of organism.
Okay.
So meaning that there's no real dichotomy between the organic and the inorganic, you know, there's a false dichotomy. So everything is ultimately biology. So, you know, in that sense, you could say, you know, people think, you know, there's biology reduced to chemistry, reduced to physics, but actually for him, physics can be reduced to biology.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a good, pardon?
A reformed biology, of course, you know.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's, and that's what I love about it. It's just, it gives you pause to sort of rethink old paradigms and structures and dogmas and things like that.
Definitely. I mean, I'd say it's two philosophers really made me question sort of axioms of thought that I just go sort of just control one unconsciously. And well, that is Whitehead. The other person is Nietzsche. You know, they're both kind of sort of undercut general modes of thought. So yeah, those two, probably the most influential philosophers I've read. Yeah.
I only know Nietzsche through other writing, through people you know, working with it and talking about it. I haven't read any of his work directly, but I like Eternal Return and Amor Fati and things like that. And you mentioned John Tullen in another conversation you had, and he was, one of his quotes that I really like is, it's not history that repeats itself, it's human nature that repeats itself, you know? So we could get into the psychobehavioral, psycho-emotional aspects of ourselves. And yeah, that's where I find Nietzsche interesting, is some of his observations on our behavior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, interestingly, when I was in Switzerland last month, they said, strange you say Nietzsche is a philosopher. We've always taken him to be a psychologist. He's certainly helpful in that regard. But I mean, his what I think his criticism of Western morality is especially powerful. And, you know, what we think of as good and evil, right and wrong, I mean, that has this, it doesn't come out of nowhere for Nietzsche. It sort of has this historical legacy that he makes explicit, and that's what's sort of groundbreaking, I think.
Yeah, and I like, because Nietzsche was a follower of Schopenhauer until he rejected him, but I like Schopenhauer's interpretation of ethics or morality, and that this is more of an instinctual process, and that there is no written in stone foundational ethics. It's something that we have to fumble our way through. I'm not quoting Schopenhauer directly when I say what I'm saying. I'm melding my own ideas into it, but so Schopenhauer's will is a blind will, essentially, if you will, and so in that I take that we have to craft our own means of being ethical creatures, of being compassionate, and I think that's what, if again, as a layperson, Spinoza's ethic or Schopenhauer's ethics was that of compassion rather than a categorical imperative or deontological imperatives. Anyway, that's a digression, but yeah, I'm moving from Nietzsche back to Schopenhauer, and we can go back to Nietzsche and saying it's the critique of the Western, you have this free will, and so therefore you can be, susceptible to right and wrongs and evil and good and all these things. And I just, that to me doesn't, that's not a good, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting how, Schopenhauer did influence Nietzsche. I mean, like Schopenhauer even used the word slave morals, which everyone attributes to Nietzsche. Schopenhauer followed Kant's kind of metaphysics or critical theory, but he rejected Kant's ethical normative morality. And he said, ethics cannot be normative, cannot be prescriptive. You can't logically tell people what they ought to do. That's just trying to control them. But you can describe it. And as you say, it was based on compassion, which was based on a metaphysical motive for him. But Nietzsche comes along, takes that, but then adds to it and says, even compassion is a Christian virtue. And if you don't believe in God, if God is dead, then even that can't be substantiated, you see. That's where it gets radical. And then that really takes you outside of your culture.
Yeah.
And it can be taken the wrong way, So, Nietzsche did influence to a certain extent fascism. He also, though, influenced the left, in terms of power structures, hierarchies, and so on. So it's a complex thinker. But Nietzsche, actually, I must say, it was probably Nietzsche who made me interested in panpsychism in the first place.
Okay.
Because it was the concept of will to power, which is based on Schopenhauer's will to survive or Spinoza's conatus. There's a whole history of that in the legacy of thought. But the will to power has a pathos, that underlies everything. A pathos, like in other words, a feeling. And in his notebooks, more than his published works, he sort of goes into that kind of more metaphysical understanding of metaphysics, more metaphysical understanding of the will to power. Although, ostensibly he wrote that he was against metaphysical systems, but nonetheless, I think he was developing one before he went mad in the late 1800s. So that got me thinking about panpsychism. And then after I read Nietzsche, I read Schopenhauer, and I think that Schopenhauer is a panpsychist. Karl Popper said he's a Kantian turned panpsychist. He's an idealist panpsychist, but nonetheless a panpsychist. And then also I read Bergson, and that all culminated with Whitehead. But Nietzsche was the trigger.
Yeah, powerful thinker. I do want to segue into another aspect of modes of sentience, a mode of sentience within modes of sentience, and that is your work with psychedelics. And I think everything we've talked about up until this point will prime us for how you treat the landscape or the system of psychedelic, our relationship with psychedelics, if that's the right way to say it. And so let's talk about that in your book, Modes of Sentience. I don't know where to start, so I'll offer it to you. You can start that conversation because there's a lot. Right. There's a lot.
Yeah. Well, that's hard. I don't know where shall I start. I guess. Well, I mean, if you're interested in consciousness, if you're interested in the philosophy of mind, phenomenology, all the cognitive sciences, I think what psychedelics offer you is intrinsically interesting, because it just gives you a much broader palette to work on when you're examining the mind. And the interesting thing that I found, coming from a sort of philosophy of mind background, was, after I experienced psychedelic psilocybin to start with, I went to the philosophy to find out, to read more about it and so on, and discovered there wasn't really that much out there. There's William James's Varieties in 1902, and Gerald Hurd wrote a bit about it, H.H. Price, but there's compared to other subjects, very little, which is surprising considering how powerful that experience was. So that got me started That's why I wrote Numernautics, really, and then Modes, and now this Bloomsbury volume on philosophy and psychedelics. At Exeter University, we've got a colloquium on psychedelics with the psychology department. We've got Breaking Convention, Europe's biggest psychedelic conference, coming to Exeter in April. Got the book, as I mentioned, various postgrad students. We've got a module on philosophy and psychedelics. We're developing an MSc in psychedelic studies. So it's like, it takes up most of my time at the moment.
Okay.
So I don't know where to start with regard to it. I mean, I'm mostly interested in how psychedelics relate to philosophy of mind and metaphysics. So I find it interesting that you can, for example, study pantheism. Let's say you're reading Spinoza, and you read the Ethics, his last book, and you can follow the arguments logically. I mean, it's very dry and whatever, but it seems that it's a very common experience that people on psychedelics have a so-called pantheistic experience, right? They don't do the hard work, the hard craft. They just sort of have this flash of Spinozism. Deleuze says, actually, that Spinoza is an interesting thinker because you can both understand his system like through, months, if not years of study, or you can have this flash, sort of paraphrasing Romain Rolland, this flash of Spinozism where you just intuit it in one go, nature is God, mind is matter, so on and so forth. And it's interesting that psychedelics seemingly do that, so then the question arises as to what is then the relation between the sort of, the discipline, the research, the philosophy, and the experience. And also, from that, it means that if we are to give credence to like Spinozism, if we actually believe it, or at least part of it, then it means that certain psychedelic experiences, which are sort of in line with Spinozism, are not necessarily hallucinations. There might be some truth behind them. So that's the sort of, and panpsychism likewise, there's so many reports about nature connectedness because, plants, whatever, have intrinsic value, intrinsic sentience. So again, you think, well, okay, should we just dismiss that as hallucination? Like obviously psychedelics do induce some hallucinations, but that doesn't mean they're all hallucinations. So then you look at the relationship between the experience or the alleged experience and the philosophy behind it. Quite fascinating, really. And then you can broaden that to anthropology, for example. So like a lot of Amerindian cultures are animistic. Most of them are in the Americas, it seems. And animism is related to panpsychism. And then you wonder, well, these panpsychological experiences that we have in the West, might they also be had in the Americas? And are those experiences what have sort of forged the religion that they have, which sort of entails looking, for a start, comparing animism and panpsychism. That's something I'm working on the side, and then looking, working with anthropologists, thinking about translations, so on and so forth. It's very hard. I mean, mind is a very hard word, right? Because when you're looking at different cultures, we have the word mind. Soul seems to entail dualism. So, but in German you've got Geist, which can be translated as mind, but also as spirit, right? And it's related to the English word ghost. In Swedish, which I speak as well, there is no word for mind at all, really. There are near synonyms, but they're not quite as general. Sinne and medvetenhet and so on. But they're not quite mind, And then when you go to the Americas and you read translations, but when you really speak to the translators, or even better, the people, I haven't done that, but you realize that the translations of mind really, or spirit, really don't make sense. So it's a really big task, but one that's very it's just it's infancy, but there's so much work to be done there.
Yeah. Absolutely. And through our Western lens, we could, stay there for the sake of stabilization. My fascination with the potential in psychedelics, and so my own history with psychedelics was 30-something years ago when I was in my 20s, and I had some no hero doses of psilocybin, but what I would call meso doses, couple grams, 2-3 grams or whatever, threshold kind of things. And then LSD, I've had a couple of really strong experiences with that, but never really gone out to the non-dual state. But again, from a Western perspective and my limited experience with it, in terms of finding that pantheistic mode of being or experiencing, is that it relates a lot to mindfulness that you see in the East, which is something that I've also explored. And I've also had some very incredible experiences with mindfulness and meditation. And I haven't been doing that for very long. I mean, I started when I was a teenager, but I didn't really take it seriously until about 12 years ago or so. But nonetheless, that you can, so I would draw this analogy that sort of mindfulness practices bringing you up to that state where you can perhaps transcend in a not literal sense, but just in a metaphoric sense, is like rowing a boat to a destination, whereas the SR-71 is your 5-MeO-DMT or something where it's going to get you there at Mach 6, and you'll be at the destination and the guy in the rowboat will be just working their way slowly to get there. That's my interpretation, is that it sort of has a parallel to a non-dual state, or a state of, bliss, or whatever you want to call it, where you have this kind of connection with something. And again, I'm a grounded kind of naturalist. I don't believe in the supernatural per se. If we can experience it, it's natural, So if it is seemingly supernatural, then, like you said, there's what is it, the plural of anecdote equals data kind of thing with psychedelic experience. Is that Wolfson, I think, said that, and I believe that. Anyway, to get to a point, I think that our use of psychedelics in the Western world, when we're beyond just having fun at a dead show or whatever, that it's a means of opening up that potential within us, I guess, to for whatever therapeutic reason. I know a lot of PTSD work is being done, depression and things like that, but I also think for a sake of going to a place where you can be a more empathetic human being, or a more caring human being, or a sensitive person, that there's potential there too. And of course, as you've said in other conversations, that psychedelics aren't all sweetness and light. There are people who are quasi-fascists who are using psychedelics and are not being given that opportunity to walk through the threshold and become more caring or more empathetic people. So I'm not saying this is a placebo, panacea. So anyway, I'll hush and let you pick up on that.
Regarding the last thing you said, is quite interesting, because in the past, when people spoke about mysticism, and James tied psychedelics, was now called psychedelics, to mysticism, it was quite common to say that mystical states invoke monism, as you say, but also this notion of going beyond good and evil. And at the same time, though, they induce nature connectedness, which seemingly, there are recent empirical studies about this, seemingly make one care for nature and become more ecologically aware as well. So in that sense, they make people more moral, one could say, one sense of moral. But in another sense, they take you out of your culture and sort of allow you to see the relativity of your culture, which means going beyond good and evil. So there's this kind of paradoxical stance to ethics that psychedelics can induce. And of course, not always the same thing in people, can widely differ. Some people, psychedelics are not even necessarily mystical. You can have experiences on psychedelics which just make you laugh, or just purely aesthetic, or they can like in the Americas, they use psychedelics to locate lost objects, to curse their enemies, to become better hunters. Your sensory awareness becomes sharper, so that you have to sort of it's like a Venn diagram where you get mystical psychedelic states and psychedelic states, and they're not necessarily the same. Or mysticism, psychedelics, let's say, have an overlap, but they are quite distinct. And there has been, because they've been illegal for 50 years, prohibited. There was a pushback 10 years ago, the start of the Psychedelic Renaissance, which said actually they're not going to fry your brain. They're actually quite, on the contrary, rather therapeutic. And that's where we are now. But then there's, that pendulum has swung a bit back, because some, obviously some private companies are sort of exaggerating claims that they're all light and roses. But of course, there are certain experiences which might have no therapeutic value at all, and in fact, on the contrary, be quite harmful to people. I know of a few cases. They're rare, but they do happen. At the same time, though, you could say that for all medicine, So.
Yeah, I know the propagandists in the United States use that with cannabis, and they say, there was a UPenn study, I think, that said, people who, and I'm going to misrepresent it, but people can go look it up if they want. And it's like people predisposed to psychosis who smoke cannabis at a young age can become psychotic, and it's like, and I see that with psychedelics. Like if you have some underlying subclinical psychopathological issue like schizophrenia or some dissociative thing going on, and you take psychedelics that might push you out either chemically or just in the experiential aspect or the phenomenological aspect, that can lead to harm. So there are people within a population, maybe they're outliers, but there are people within a population that if they have something in the background that can be exaggerated. I know who was it with Pink Floyd that had that the guitarist. Why am I forgetting his name?
Gilmore?
No, not Gilmore. Gilmore replaced him.
Barrett.
Sid Barrett. Sid Barrett. I think he had some underlying issues psychologically, and he just did way too much acid, and ended up hurting himself and becoming locked out or whatever. So
no, it's not for everyone. And set and setting. People always talk about set and setting. Make sure you're in a good mindset and you're in a safe environment with friends or whatever. Doesn't always happen, but some people say even the negative experiences can be positive. Like for example, if a lost harmful memory is evoked. Interesting that psychedelics can even do that, by the way. That's another interesting philosophical thing, that memories are suddenly accessed again. Also false memories, I should say. But that you work through that with a therapist ideally can mean that a negative experience can be made positive, but it's not always like that. And the fact of the matter is, I think psychedelics are more than medicine. That's one use of them, but it's more than that. I mean, they have many functions, like I said, for hunting in some cases. They can be used for political ends. Marcuse even spoke about that. Spiritual ends. They could be used in society generally with the decline of Christianity, for example, in Britain. This could be some kind of spiritual replacement to a certain extent, So medicine is just one framework in which we're currently looking at psychedelics, but just because they're not necessarily medicinal in all cases doesn't mean therefore they have no value. The value transcends medicine.
Yeah. No, it's a dynamic relationship that we have, that our minds have with, and that's, go back to Whitehead for a moment. There's two types of relationality going on for me. There's the chemical interaction, which if chemicals are species or they are part of the organism, then it is a relational experience. It is this monad or this individuated thing, this living creature interacting with its environment, which essentially is, without getting too monistic, is a system. And also the relationality of mind, of what new thought, what genesis is arising in the experience. So again, for some people it's creativity, some people it's activism, and or has a more subtle, mundane, utilitarian aspect to it. So I guess we are getting a little bit close on time. I know you said you were about an hour, so I will ask, maybe as a sort of a wrap-up question, what corporations aside and their drives and intentions aside, what do you think we're looking at in the next 20 years if we are moving forward uninhibited by governmental crackdowns and hysteria reforming itself and trying to dissuade or block the safe not quite laboratory conditions, but control conditions for exploring the mind, exploring the psyche, again, therapeutic and other matters aside, what can we learn about ourselves, do you think, under the right conditions, to add a dimension to our sentience, our current status as metacognitive people? If that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely hard to predict what will happen. I think though that MDMA, for example, which you can define as a psychedelic, will become legal for medicinal use against PTSD soon. I think psilocybin's heading that way. I mean, when you look at the legalization of cannabis, for example, and how that's sort of adding some value to society, it seems you can easily imagine that's going to happen to other drugs soon. But the interesting thing about the medicalization of psychedelics is that there's an antagonism between that and the legalization sometimes, you know. So if it's not in the interest of the people who produce the psychedelic protocol and medicine that anyone can use it, you know, it's better for them in terms of finance to have monopolies. So the danger is that will happen, you know, psychedelics become decriminalized, but only for medicinal use, which means that people will still go to prison for using magic mushrooms or whatever, which seems pretty absurd. They're not necessarily in antagonism though. So I hope that, I think they'll, again, can't predict it. There might be a huge backlash, you know, who knows, but I would hope that psychedelics do become medicalized, but that's not their only remit. I hope that they become decriminalized for the general populace, but perhaps regulated. So you wouldn't want people on acid driving down the motorway, for example, right? Like alcohol is regulated, you know.
Sure.
It's seemingly fine. You don't want children, maybe infants, taking LSD and so on either, you know. So there's room for regulation, room for taxes there as well. At the same time, you know, there's this kind of mystique in it being illegal, you know. So, more than that, though, generally speaking. So those are just sort of things next 10 years. But I think, you know, Schopenhauer, whom we've spoken about a bit, he said that, well, he was an atheist. He said that there's a metaphysical need within all people. And that's often, you know, that often comes out as religion, you know, one spiritual side. But I think there is this kind of, you know, we humans are limited in how much we know. And at least we sort of realize that there's so much more about reality of which we are ignorant. And perhaps psychedelics give us they might not reveal reality as it is in itself, but they might give us new ideas. I mean, there's this study last year showing that psychedelics shift the tendency to shift people's metaphysical beliefs away from physicalism towards panpsychism. Interesting imperial study paper. So there is, like, you know, the possibility that psychedelics will somehow, but I mean, this is, you know, very speculative, but, you know, perhaps they will replace traditional religion in the sense that they provide people this kind of metaphysical experience, which is real. It's, you know, I mean, it's a real experience. It's not like going to a, you know, Anglican church and doing your hymns and prayers. Right. Pretty dry and I mean, there's nothing exceptional about it. I mean, unless it's, you know, beautiful cathedral, of course. Rupert Sheldrake's always talking about how cathedrals were created to induce altered states of consciousness. And I'm sure that, so, you know, these could be repurposed perhaps for psychedelic use. There's an underground, Rupert Sheldrake keeps telling me about this underground movement called Cathedrals on Cannabis in Britain. Oh, okay. You know? But I can't find anything about it online, but well, because it's underground, obviously. But anyway, so I think there could be a sociological use for psychedelics in the future, but you have to be very careful. You need regulation, obviously, I think, and you can't just legalize things because, you know, certain cacti and toads and whatever, you know, they could go extinct if they're overused. And monopolies taking over without regulation. So it's a minefield, you know. But one can be hopeful.
And I would be happy to see at least academia having access to it and doing research. Again, maybe just in the realm of psychology and understanding both how to work, again, medicinally, working with PTSD and depression and things like that, cluster headaches, whatever it is that they're after. The other thing that came into my mind when you were talking a moment ago was you hear these urban legends about how, I don't know if it was Watson and Crick or somebody working with DNA double helix strands was using psychedelics and had an insight. And you hear the legends of like people like Terence McKenna working with the I Ching on high doses of psilocybin and coming out with these profound insights. So that's legend, but I wonder if people who are in an academic discipline do a mesodose, again, maybe a threshold dose where they're still coherent, still full executive faculty going on, that they can have insights. You know, there's that joke, I know when I was a kid, I'd get really high and I'd have these incredible thoughts. And then when I sobered up, I'm like, oh, what the hell was that? I thought I was thinking about it was so cool, but maybe it was bullshit. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I think they can be intellectual catalysts. So
Yeah.
Even if they're not veridical, objectively true, they can give you insights. An example of that is Carlo Rovelli, the physicist. It seems that he wrote that his initiation into physics, really, astrophysics, was an LSD experience he had where he experienced timelessness.
Okay.
Which sounds like a paradox. To experience seems to be time, but it wasn't, apparently. And this got him, looking into the nature of time, which brought him into physics. But of course, it can also bring you into philosophy and metaphysics. The view that things are alive, plants have a basic form of sentience under psychedelics that can make you look into it, and there's a lot of research on that at the moment. So at the very least, it can like spark an interest in people to, as you suggest, do further research into things that like otherwise might not be, would just be considered obviously wrong or bonkers or whatever. Yeah. So they're very creative. They also they make you appreciate aesthetic levels are heightened, and you become therefore more interested in art and beauty and so on. So they are, they're for the most very useful. They just basically enrich experience. They give you different types of experience, and for the types of experience you already have, they act as amplifiers. And so they're certainly valuable. Yeah, they have a dangerous aspect to them, but so do most things that are valuable. They always have a risk, don't they? Yeah. So I think that these positives can be brought out. We have to move away from the medicinal model only and look at the greater value that these chemicals have. And I should also say that, as you've sort of mentioned, it's not just the drugs that induce these experiences. You can achieve it through, for example, holotropic breathwork or Grothian breathwork, and forms of fasting, dieting, so on and so forth.
Yeah. There's many avenues, but I think if your aim is pro-social and positive, that you are seeking an outcome. I don't like the word enlightenment, but to enlighten yourself further or move yourself forward in ideas and feelings and so forth, there's certainly an option when done responsibly and within the constraints of social contracts and so forth, and laws and things like that. Yeah, no, there's huge potential there, and I'm glad to see, and I hope younger generations, people who engage are responsible and realize what they're playing with. You don't know what's going to show up, and you have to be informed when mentally prepared for that experience, because it is life-shattering. If it goes wrong, and you come back, but it's not fun. So as a caveat.
No, they're dangerous. They're dangerous tools, but powerful tools.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I told a story. I don't know if it was who my guest was, but I told a story about phencyclidine one time, and I didn't know I was taking it, and I smoked an incredible amount of PCP, thinking it was just bad marijuana, and oh my God, it was amazing, and it gave me some insights for sure, but it also scared the shit out of me. So that's a caveat. But yeah, just complete disembodiment, complete projection. Not that I think it was supernatural projection. I think it's just how our process. So my sight and all that was all askew, and but I could literally see myself from a distance, and I was like, I need to get back there. So yeah, I just say that as a caveat to the audience. This is not a like alcohol, and even alcohol can bite you, and you can have
drink a bottle of whiskey, and that's going to have a big effect on you, right?
And like you said, I think about William James, I think, or was it Davies, that alcohol is the first step in the into the psychedelic, altered consciousness and so forth.
The great yes-sayer in man, alcohol, the first step to mystic consciousness. That's quite right. Alcohol, and it can be certainly, but the psychedelic, which in my experience is the most potent, is 5-MeO-DMT. That is something that's a different level psychedelic that I would not really advise anyone to take. Although they are doing trials now on 5-MeO-DMT for treatment-resistant depression.
Okay.
I think it's just like an ontological shock, it just like smacks you out of reality and
breaks that cycle.
But it's a last resort, treatment resistant.
Are they doing full gonzo shots of 5-MeO DMT where you're just, shot into the heart of the universe kind of thing, or is it more of a low dose? You can't do low dose 5-MeO.
Oh, really? There's a threshold, isn't it? It's like a switch 5-MeO.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. You can actually when you vaporize it, it's a switch, but you can actually take a pill, and there are other methods as well. But the phase 2 trial that's about to begin for treatment-resistant depression is actually nasal. It's a nasal spray, believe it or not.
Okay.
So, and I have never tried that, so I don't know exactly how that will work.
Okay, but does it bring?
There is, stereotypically a breakthrough. So that's the sort of switch. And at that point, you see, commonly you see a white light. Within a few seconds, you lose your hearing, your vision, all your senses, your memory, your cognition, any form of reason, concepts, language. It's all gone. Your sense of self is gone. And then the light goes, but time goes, space goes, but something remains, which is this extreme sense of profundity. Extreme. And that's all you can say about it, really, because well, in that Spinoza essay I wrote about, I tried to elucidate it a bit more, but it was apophatic, in other words, negative. It's like not this, not that. So it's the great whiteout, as they say.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's dangerous, a dangerous one. It's it takes a long time to process that. You come out sweating and swearing, and you're shocked by the time on the clock. And I imagine it's not.
Those days are behind me now, and I think if I were on my last days, I would do it. If I had, if I knew I was going to be dead within a short while, I think I would do it, because I had a bit of a brain injury years ago, and I just can't tolerate anything. I can barely tolerate caffeine. I can't drink alcohol anymore. No cannabis, no opiates, nothing. And so, it's like nature held this intervention to a hedonistic Irishman here. And I didn't bring it on myself. I got sick, and I had this brainish injury, and I'm like, that's just the cruelty of nature. But anyway, and it's good in a way, because now that's why I meditate. I do that that's my new thing. And and I like it, because it's a very, very, very subtle form of what you just said. Like, I've gotten into meditative states where I sort of sign off as an ego. There's still something there registering things, but I have no sense of my body. I am temporarily aware. I know time is passing, because usually I have drone soundscapes or something going to distract me. But it's a very pleasant dissociation. It's a very pleasant uncoupling, and it's a relief to not, be you for a while. And but it's nothing near the profound nature of what you're describing. But it's a very subtle detachment. So as an alternative for those out there. But and. I'd like to bring you back. I know we've crossed over just about an hour, so maybe I'll pick up a copy of Mnemonics. What's the latest book you have that you've co-authored?
Well, that's an edited volume. It's like 15 authors, including myself, called Philosophy and Psychedelics: Frameworks for Exceptional Experience. It's coming out. It's a hardback now, so an academic book, very expensive. But in March, it's coming out as a paperback for like $20. So look out for that. There, you got Whitehead in there, Spinoza in there, realism. Hegel, gratitude, critical theory, Adorno, an interesting mix of different approaches to psychedelic experience, really.
Okay. Well, if you enjoyed this conversation and you have an interest in coming back, I would love to have you back. And again, perhaps I can pick up a copy of that or Mnemonics, and we can talk some more. I'd love to pick your brain about some things. Just get more insights into philosophy of mind, into ontology and metaphysics, and on and on and on. So, and I know, again, anyone who's subscribed to my channel is here because of other philosophers of mind or people in general who are asking these kind of questions and having these conversations. So you will be well received. It's been
a pleasure. I mean, I love talking philosophy of mind, metaphysics, of course. So it's just a pleasure. So I'm very glad you invited me here.
Well, and I'm deeply grateful that you were able to join me in a conversation. So, Peter, I will say goodbye to you after we're done recording. To the YouTube audience, thank you so much for your being here. I appreciate that, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation and the insights that Dr. Hughes provided. So I'll say goodbye to you guys on YouTube, and have a lovely day or night wherever you are.